Welcome to ZKast, everybody. I'm Zeus Caravel from ZK Research. As always, I'm your host. I'm joined today by Mike Bushong, VP of Cloud Ready Data Center at Juniper Networks. Mike, why don't you say hi to everybody?
Hey, thanks for having me today, and hello, everyone out there.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking data center, which, it's a pretty exciting topic. There's always lots of stuff going on in that area. Before we get started, though, I do want to give a shout out to eWeek, my media partner. All ZKasts are done in conjunction with the eWeek eSpeaks program. So thanks to eWeek. Mike, now you work and live and eat and everything in data centers. What's going on with data centers, right? We've had this massive number of people work from home. We've moved more and more applications to the cloud. And so I think there's some conventional wisdom out there that data centers are becoming less relevant. But tell us why that's not the case.
Yeah, I think the whole data center thing, when cloud came in, right, the whole idea was that cloud's going to wipe through and take out all of the data centers, that everything essentially moves to Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, whoever. That hasn't been true, right? I think what most people are looking at is kind of these hybrid environments. Certainly workloads are moving to the cloud. I don't want to say that I'm like one of the people who says that cloud isn't happening. It's absolutely happening. But I think what's really going on is there's a bit of a bifurcation in the market. For companies that are maybe at the lower end, they might look at cloud first or cloud only because their needs are fairly constrained, right? They've got a kind of a well understood set of applications. For everybody else, they've got kind of a bunch of different applications, and the whole idea that merely lifting and shifting an application from on-prem into the cloud was going to yield some huge financial impact, that hasn't really happened. And so it's left people kind of in this environment where they've got, what they've got on-prem, they've got, new emerging, let's say SaaS workloads, and they're leveraging cloud. And what this leads to is not just, sort of these hybrid environments, but hybrid and multi environments, right? On-prem, public. The net of all of that is that data center all of a sudden is no longer about the four walls that you're kind of managing and the equipment that you have in it. It's kind of this operational domain, this administrative domain that extends out across different areas in the network. And then with all of that makes data center hot again because it's all about data center operations. I think we're actually going through a bit of a data center renaissance, frankly. And then you mentioned the work from home thing, right? You get more people consuming more applications, trying to do more things in a distributed way. It's like that's actually built up a bunch of demand for the services that are being offered at a data center. So it's not just that operations and innovation is alive, it's that kind of the current environment that we find ourselves in, it's really stimulating growth in this overall space. And we see that when you start looking at kind of how companies are doing who are in this data center proper area.
I like the way you framed it up, because data center maybe is now become a term to describe operations versus a physical place. But I do think that, I think we analysts and, I write for a lot of public media tend to overswing the pendulum sometimes, where we say everything's moving to the cloud or everything's moving mobile or whatever. And that's just not true. I will say, though, that every business I talk to wants a cloud model. That doesn't necessarily mean public cloud. In fact, my research shows that 95% of companies will adopt a hybrid cloud. There are just certain scenarios where things will run. And by the way, the 95% number is enterprises. So I do think you're right. Small businesses can go all cloud. But when you talk about larger enterprises, they have specific workflows, data sovereignty issues, they got regulatory issues, compliance issues, and you just can't move everything to the public cloud. In fact, somebody asked me the other day, do I see a day where everything's in public cloud? And my answer was, maybe, but I'll long be retired, so I don't care when that happens. Now, the other big disruptor in data centers has been this thing that we call edge. And this has given rise to what I call, and Gartner uses this term as well, distributed cloud, which describes an operating model, to your point, where you have one logical cloud environment that spans public clouds, private clouds, and edge locations. And that's fundamentally different, because historically what you had with data centers, well, they were centralized centers of data, right? But now you've got these distributed environments. So can you talk a little bit about edge and how that's really evolved the role of the network in data centers?
Yeah. So if we take cloud just generally, I mean, cloud is I think it's really an operational construct. It's how do you manage things? The whole idea of moving to different consumption models and and being able to spin up applications when and where you need. We look at the kind of classic cloud. It was the idea that we would bring users and data to the application, right? Things were hosted centrally, and then you could sort of reroute everything into these central locations. What we see with distributed edge is kind of changing that a little bit. Let's take the applications, let's take the data, and push it closer to the users. In some cases, it could be because there's performance requirements or latency requirements. It could be things like 5G are actually changing the whole expectation of user experience and what users are demanding. And so it's no longer sufficient to just route everything through these national data centers. What you've got to do is essentially push the data centers out closer to the users. Now, this is actually not that different, and I'll say spiritually, right? Architecturally, it's very different, but spiritually, it's similar to this whole idea of scale out, right? Instead of having these big, massive things, what I want to do is create smaller components and pull them and sort of distribute the load across a larger number of elements. When we do that, right, we trade off the performance piece. We get performance advantages, but what we pick up, the cost of that is essentially distributed operations. It's all the administrative things that you have to do to manage these devices. Well, it's true in data center as well. If I move away from a large national data center and I replace that with dozens, maybe hundreds of distributed data centers in this distributed edge, what I pick up is an operational burden. And so what we see with the whole move to distributed edge is it's a shift, and it's emphasizing once again the operational tenets of cloud, which brings us back to kind of the opening comments around cloud. It's how do I get cloud-like operations so I can reliably and repeatably deploy applications to preserve a consistent user experience when my applications and the domains over which I have to manage them are distributed in all kinds of different physical locations, with a diversity of connectivity, a diversity of applications. Like that's really the game in this whole distributed edge space.
Yeah, in fact, I would argue when you talk about operations, a lot of businesses hadn't really moved to true cloud operations. I think when you think about, if I pick up a legacy workload and I do a lift and shift to a public cloud, I maybe change the location of that, but I'm not really changing the way I operate it, right? So I don't get the benefit of the scale out and things like that. And so this, now what I actually think is we're actually moving to an era where we do have cloud operations, and that's giving rise to true multi-cloud. And I use the word true multi-cloud because historically, when people did multi-cloud, they were using multiple centralized clouds. But to me, that's not the same as multi-cloud, where I could have one operational construct across all my clouds. So, I do think the environment does become more, a little more, complicated here. And so that certainly changed the role, of operations and security and things. Now, you recently made a number of announcements, right? Through the Apstra acquisition that Juniper made. Can you just walk us through those?
Yeah. So, just as a brief reminder of what Apstra does, right? So this whole idea of Apstra is intent-based networking. It's the idea that rather than working configuration statement by configuration statement, you ought to be able to declare top down, here's what I want my data center to do. So we took that intent model and we've extended it actually to the edge. So we've said that there are architectures that are different than these centralized data centers, right? Typically called collapsed fabrics, where you don't necessarily need a whole bunch of devices, use a couple of access switches, maybe some TORs. And what we're doing then is essentially extending the benefits of intent-based networking to those types of deployments. This is big, right? As we start thinking about smaller data centers, use cases like IoT, we start looking at things like telco cloud, where you've got let's say carriers that are distributing their data centers out in support of their 5G services. There's a whole different kind of collection of things that we can cover within that basic space. That's a big part of this overall announcement, right? Extending the goodness of Apstra to new deployments. Beyond that, we did some stuff on the security side, which we can talk about in a bit. And then, of course, when you pick up something like intent-based networking, it really is a different operating model, which raises a question, especially like in your enterprise clients, right? It raises a basic question. There's this thing that I want that is different than what I have. How do I get there? And so we've put together some migration services that are really aimed at how do we transition from environments as we know it today to environments as we want them tomorrow.
Yeah, I want to drill down on the security side because Juniper obviously has a very big security business as well. You know, when you think of a traditional data center, it was a closed environment. You could control a lot of things just by locking down the walls, right? So now that we're moving more and more things to the edge, we're using public clouds. We're kind of mixing public and private. That really makes securing a lot more complicated. So can you talk about those challenges and then tell me what, you know, how Juniper is addressing those?
Sure. I mean, you just spelled it out. If I've got different types of users accessing different types of applications, all run in different types of data centers that are all supported by different types of vendor equipment and different types of vendor software, like what's the problem? I mean, that that's the
That
whole
should be easy.
yeah, it should be. It sounds amazing, right? Like what that sounds like to me, by the way, is job security. So for all of you out there, like that's good stuff. I think the real challenge is, and this is when you talk about true multi-cloud, I mean, you mentioned it. It's the idea that I want uniform operations and I want diverse underlying, I guess, infrastructure. What Apstra is trying to do is provide unified operations. I want to do things in a common way, regardless of the underlying infrastructure, regardless of the vendor, regardless of the particular domain type, regardless of the underlying users and applications, whatever. Let me provide kind of a consistent way of applying policy across this diverse environment. What we're doing in this particular release is we're taking this idea of group-based policy, the idea that we have policy and control that's applied at like a tenant or an application level. And then and essentially what Apstra does is it abstracts that policy from the underlying devices. Then we go and apply that policy across whichever devices are required in order to support that overall policy structure. And then we'll validate that the policy that's deployed is essentially working as intended. And the way we do that, right? So underpinning this idea of intent, this declarative model, this way of pushing, let's say, configuration and state information into devices. Underpinning that, we actually create a model. We say, here's the network as it's intended. And then we deploy a bunch of sensors and we say, here is the network as deployed. And when the as intended and the deployed match, we give you a big green light, everything is good. When as deployed and as intended do not match, then we can flag that there's a problem. So let me give you kind of an easy example. You create policy for a particular application, but of course, multiple applications run across these different, on the switches, the data center fabric. What if somebody else makes a different policy instruction that overlaps with the policy for application A and application B? What we want to do is flag when there's overlapping policy. We want to be able to tell you when something is different than as intended, so that when you get in this complex environment of many to many for everything we're trying to do, let us tell you if there's conflicts so that you can resolve that conflict ahead of time. The worst time to possibly find out that your policies are not working as intended is in the middle of your ransomware attack, right? So segmentation becomes a key mitigation activity when you think about some of the security stuff going on. You can't afford to find out that it's not going to work at the point of attack, at the point that something's gone wrong. What Apstra is doing is not just provisioning it, but telling you up front, is your policy assured? Is it working the way you expect it to work?
Thanks for that answer, Mike. I know one of the big value propositions of Apstra, and there are other intent-based solutions, but I believe Apstra is the only real multi-vendor one. So can you talk a little bit about why, how that's grown in importance? Obviously, everybody wants to be able to choose the vendor they use, but I think historically they haven't been able to. So what have you seen there from your customers and how they've been leveraging that?
Sure. I mean, so yes, the idea behind intent-based is that if we can work from a declarative model over the top, then we're abstracted naturally from the underlying devices. This means that we are in a very good architectural position to support multi-vendor. Why does that matter? Look, everybody is these days talking about supply chain. If you want to be able to order devices from vendor A or vendor B or vendor C, but your operations are sort of fixed, then you're in a position that you actually can't do that. What Apstra allows us to do is to say, here's my data center, the way it's constructed. I don't care about the underlying devices. My teams are trained, my services are deployed, applications are deployed, regardless of what the underlying vendors are. Then, depending on what the lead times are, then you can go and take advantage of vendor A, vendor B, vendor C. Now, look, supply chain won't always be a constraint, right? We think that that things will improve at some point, but at that point, then the question is, do you want your vendors to compete for your business? If you want economic leverage, for instance, then keeping your vendors competing for incremental capacity is a huge thing that gives you flexibility, right? It could be that they're competing based on feature functionality. It could be based on price and performance, but this gives you the flexibility to make the decisions that you need to make. So you can avoid these 7, 9, 10-year type engagements where you say, like, I'm committed longer than I'm going to be in the role. I'm committed to this particular vendor. What we're essentially doing is unlocking that. And we've seen huge traction here. I mean, we've got folks who come and they say, look, appreciate that Juniper has hardware. However, I've got Cisco or Arista or Dell or Sonic or Cumulus or Juniper, whatever. I've got different suppliers. Can you solve my operational challenges? And we've got accounts today where it's literally it's pure software over the top, breathing additional life into an existing investment, which allows them to get more out of what they've already spent, and then gives them a plausible path to go and extract additional value over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole shift to software that took place in the network industry years ago was supposed to allow better network vendor interoperability, and it never really led to that. In fact, I've had people describe their vendor lock-in situation as being a little like Hotel California, where you can check out, but you can't ever leave. And so, unless you wait, the best time to do that is always with CIO turnover, right? So that can be long cycles. Now, I did want to ask you about the acceptance that you're seeing with intent-based networking and autonomous operations. I know when Apstra first launched, when I talked to IT people about this concept of autonomous operations, to use a technical term, it gave them the heebie-jeebies. I mean, a lot of them were very concerned about it. And so what do you see now? And I'm assuming, work from home has played, a role in getting to look at your product, but are you seeing more acceptance of it? And what are some of those low-hanging fruit use cases where if people were to adopt it, they could take advantage of it faster?
Yeah, I think people in general are getting more comfortable with automation. I still think it's a long journey. The processes that surround automation are sometimes immature, especially in some of the enterprise type accounts. So I think there's still work to go and move forward. But in terms of like basic use cases, I think you start looking at how quickly can I stand up additional capacity? How do I expand? How do I add new racks? How do I add new servers? How do I add new pods depending on the size of the data center? You start looking at this whole idea of mean time to innocence. We have a good customer in the retail space where they have an online shopping platform. And at the end of each day, they've got, there's items that sit in their shopping carts that don't get closed. And of course, the teams come back and say, we didn't convert these to sales. There's a network problem. These things timed out. What's the mean time to innocence? They spend their time literally every day having to prove that there wasn't some network issue that caused these purchases not to go through. What we can do on the Apstra side is by demonstrating that the network is working as intended and that there's no issues. It's like that mean time to innocence is merely, at that point, it's like a dashboard view. Here things are working as intended. That takes an operational practice that would have been manual, triggered by people, forcing other people to go in, run a bunch of commands, and prove that things are working as you want them to. Now that becomes just part of the system. It's this idea that we can provide information, provide insight, like that. That's how you get to some of these autonomous operations. It's not about removing keystrokes and making it like, I can type in some command faster. It's about helping you make decisions much faster. In this case, the decision is, do I need to go and troubleshoot the network, or are things working again the way they're supposed to be working? So maybe you should go and look at other things that might be causing a problem on the retail side. Like that's the amount of time that saves. It's not just the time it takes to execute commands, but it's the time it takes for people to coordinate across functions. That's how you drive a lot of value, not just into the IT or the networking team, but into the enterprise at large.
Yeah, I liken the transition to autonomous networking a little bit like the transition to autonomous vehicles, right? Nobody, except maybe Elon Musk, would jump into a car with no steering wheel, no controls, and no driver, right? But we're all willing to drive a car now and actually like features like parallel park assist and lane change alerts and some of those things. And so, baby steps will get us there. And one day down the road, we'll have fully autonomous operations. But I do think there is some trust that needs to be built up here. So last question for you, Mike. If I look at Juniper's kind of bigger messaging, right? Juniper talks a lot about experience first networking. And so can you tell us what that is, and then how does Apstra fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea behind experience first is this, it's the notion that the things we optimize for are changing. Where it used to be all about, price and performance, it was about, transport and moving packets. Look, that's table stakes, right? When you can move the packets, the question is, what do you do from there? It's no longer about, is your network up, right? And user experience is the new uptime. It's just not the case that having, your high availability is enough to declare success. You've got to look and say, well, are things working the way that you want them to work? Do applications function in the data center adequately to support the business? And if that's the case, then you have to do more than merely provision things so that connectivity is in place. You've got to be able to assure that things are working continuously the way they're supposed to. You've got to make sure that the applications have not just the connectivity, but they've got all the things that drive overall experience. For instance, what does latency look like within the application? Are you seeing intermittent drops? Are you seeing, congestion that's leading to changes in application side behavior? If you look northbound into the application space, are we seeing things that are happening, at the application side, or maybe within some of the VMware, suite of tools? And is that leading to decisions that need to be made or information that needs to be sourced from the underlying network? This is it's so much broader than just merely connecting things. The whole role of Apstra is essentially saying, look, first, let's make it as simple as possible to get the network up and running. It's table stakes. Let's do it well, but let's do it quickly so that you don't have to spend time on that. Second, the whole idea of reliability is not that, hey, I've pushed some configuration out and it should be working. It's like, can I demonstrate that it's working? And that extending those workflows beyond merely pushing the configuration, but to looking at sort of the assurance and reliability side, that's a big push towards, as you start thinking about, what are the types of things that impact experience? We talked about the policy overlap. Okay, so you've set your policy. Does that mean you're good? Well, maybe, but if somebody else has set conflicting policy, isn't the outcome that you want that you've got a secure, that you have a secure posture for a particular set of users, whether they're applications or tenants or whoever? It's more than merely pushing configuration out. It's got to be this closed loop validation. That's what Apstra is trying to do. And if we can do that in an environment that's multi-vendor, if we can do an environment that's multi-domain, if we can do that in an environment that's multi-technology, multi-topology, everything becomes multi over time. If Apstra can be that unified operations platform over the top of all of those multis, that's what we're trying to drive here at Juniper.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Mike. And, Apstra leading you to a multi-everything world, I guess a multi world. So, with that, we're going to wrap up. I think that was a great overview of your announcements. And, clearly the data center has never been more important, right? Everything is moving to some kind of data center, be it, a centralized one, public cloud, or in an edge. So again, thanks, Mike Bushong from Juniper Networks for joining me. I'm Zeus Caravallo from ZKast signing off. Don't forget to click to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.